When people talk about the American Mafia, they most often speak of New York and more rarely Chicago. But the Mafia has spread its tentacles far beyond these cities, and the largest city in Massachusetts, Boston, was no exception. As early as the late 19th century, mobsters began to take over the local underworld, and during the fateful Castellammarese War for the American Mafia, as it was the boss of the Boston family who was regarded as the boss of the American Mafia bosses. For more than a century in the history of the Boston Mafia, a lot happened. Wars with other gangs, and influence comparable to the official authorities and internal squabbles, and of course, the setup of James Whitey Bulger. So if you're interested in hearing what the American Mafia was like outside of New York and Chicago, then meet the Boston Mafia on the other side of the law. Evidence of Italian organized crime in Boston goes back to the late 1880s. For example, we know that in 1889, millionaire Edward Cunningham was shot and killed. This after he ordered poachers off his property in Milton. The poachers who had collected game from his property were three Italians, Giuseppe Ignazio De Luca, Gioacchino Cocchiara, and Saverio Amato. A minor scuffle ensued between them and the millionaire, during which the latter was fatally wounded. In the mid-1890s, the head of the US Secret Service, William Hazen, stated that mafia organizations existed in Boston and several other American cities. This was not an unfounded assertion. In the early 1900s, the Boston police received complaints from 7 Italians about extortion of money. It was later discovered that the money was for legal fees for then boss of bosses Giuseppe Morello, who was on trial for the murder of Benedetto Madonia. Those 7 Italians were not members of the Mafia, but were clearly connected to it in some way, most likely through counterfeiting, which was the most common way at the time for the Mafia to bring in outside people. Their connection to the Mafia is confirmed by the fact that the letters they received explicitly stated that the money was required for Morello. The Mafia would not send letters revealing the name of the boss of all bosses to leftist people. The letters themselves were sent from New York, but the recipients feared reprisals while in Boston, proving the widespread distribution of the Mafia throughout the United States, including Boston. There is also information from a 1970s Boston Mafia informant, Vincent Teresa, who stated that his grandfather, Don Vincent Teresa, was one of the first Mafia leaders in the 1890s through the 1920s, but there is no corroboration of these stories. Boston's first known Mafia boss was Gaspare Di Cola. He was a Sicilian who was born in 1866 and immigrated to the United States in 1892. It is known that this man owned a fruit and vegetable business in Boston, but this job was a cover for his main activity, which was running the young Boston Mafia. In 1916, he received a letter from the Black Hand and ignored it. The Black Hand, if anyone doesn't know, was a method of extortion used by a wide variety of Italian gangsters. These were letters threatening and demanding money. It was not uncommon for members of the Mafia to receive such letters, for not everyone was aware of their status. On September 16, 1916, returning with his beloved from a meeting of the Italian Cultural Society called Society of Dante Alighieri, Gaspare Di Cola was caught by 2 unknown men at the station. One of them pulled out a firearm and shot Di Cola 5 times. He died instantly. After Di Cola's death, Italian organized crime needed a new head, which turned out to be Gaspare Messina. He was born on August 7, 1879 in Sicily in the commune of Salemi. In November 1905, he and his wife Francesca went to America on their honeymoon, where they ended up staying. The newlyweds settled in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood that was less than a mile from the home of the local Mafia boss Niccolo Schiro. It was around this time that Gaspare Messina became involved in criminal activity and joined the American Mafia. Between 1914 and 1915, he moved from Brooklyn to Boston. There is also an opinion that his move was lobbied by the then boss of the bosses, Salvatore De Aquila. But in the end, Messina, as the boss of Boston, was quite an independent character. Messina was known to be involved in money counterfeiting. In 1923, Secret Service agents caught Italian Salvatore Leonardi for carrying out a major money counterfeiting operation in New England. They found on him a letter from a member of the Buffalo crime family, Gaetano Capodicasa, addressed to Messina. This letter indicated that the head of the Boston Mafia had placed an order with Capodicasa for a forgery that cost him $100. Despite such clear evidence, Gaspare Messina was not charged in the case. When Salvatore D'Aquila was murdered in 1928, Giuseppe Mazzaria became the new boss of bosses, and shortly thereafter, the New York Mafia experienced a conflict known as the Castellammarese War. In brief, a group of mobsters led by Salvatore Maranzano revolted against Mazzaria, and a confrontation began between them. In fact, this war is a large-scale event worthy of a separate video and can be found on my channel. I advise you to watch it to more fully visualize the picture of what is happening. The title of this video is The Birth of the New York Mafia. Now, speaking of the Boston Mafia, I will only note that being an intelligent and shrewd leader during the Castellammarese War, Messina was appointed temporary boss of bosses and took Mazzaria's place. After the war ended and Mazzaria was assassinated, Messina was ousted by Castellammarese leader Salvatore Maranzano. Messina, on the other hand, returned to his home in Somerville and went about his business. These included not only mafia affairs, but also legal business, a billiard room in Somerville, and selling gasoline in Boston. Salvatore Maranzano didn't last long either. His tenure as boss of all bosses ended with his assassination and the mafia's rejection of the old management system. The position of boss of all bosses was abandoned and the commission was created, a body made up of the bosses of the most powerful families in the country, which was responsible for settling disputes and deciding important issues by voting. In 1932, Gaspare Messina resigned. From then on, he became a kind of consultant to the mafiosi, a kind of retired godfather. Having retired from business, Messina retained not only authority but also wealth. He had 2 houses, a farm, a steady income from businesses, and illegal lottery in Boston. After Messina, the New England mob boss was Philip Buccola. But before we get to him, it's worth saying that there were 2 mafia families in New England for a while, which the commission merged into one in 1932. The first, the one discussed before, was based in Boston, and the second was based in Providence. Prior to the merger, this family was headed by Frank Morelli. Morelli came from a large, poor family of Italian immigrants. Like his brothers, he became involved in robbery from a young age. Between 1920 and 1924, Morelli was in prison. He was released just as Prohibition was being enacted and bootlegging was already entering its most active phase. Morelli seized the opportunity and used his power and connections to take control of the bootlegging businesses, taking over the illegal gambling business as well. He thus became the dominant figure in Providence. Later, when the commission decided to merge the families, Morelli retained his power over Providence, but Buccola formally became the sole boss. Born in a town in Sicily called Palermo, Buccola was an educated man and adventurer. He studied at a university in Italy and an institution in Switzerland, and before the revolution, he had time to travel around Russia. Moving to the United States in 1920, Buccola joined the American Mafia and quickly rose through the ranks. As mentioned, Buccola was officially appointed boss in 1932. The reign of Philip Buccola is marked by the weakening of the influence of such criminal organizations of Boston as the Solomon Gang and the Guston Gang, at the expense of which the Italian Mafia significantly strengthened its position in the city. The Guston Gang was an Irish-American criminal organization led by Frank Wallace. With the beginning of the Prohibition era, these guys were involved in the illegal sale of alcohol, transporting the goods by boat from abroad, and later simply stealing liquor from other gangsters. Gang members stole truckloads of liquor, which included the property of Italians. Eventually, Frank Wallace and his deputy Bernard Walsh were invited to a meeting with Buccola and mobster Joseph Lombardo to discuss the controversy. But when the Irish gangsters arrived at the meeting place, the mobsters opened fire on them. With the death of the leader, infighting began in the gang, and as a result, the influence of Irish gangsters in Boston was quite weak until the 1950s. Charles Solomon, known by the nickname King, was of Russian Jewish descent and owned an extensive drug, liquor and gambling business, and he owned numerous nightclubs. Solomon openly vilified Italians and sought to cut them off from bootlegging and deprive them of their hard-won prerogatives after killing the top of the Guston gang. So in January 1933, he was shot dead in a nightclub restroom by two mafia men. The territories under his control were fragmented and distributed among his aides, causing the gang's influence to be severely weakened. For Bucola's successor, Raymond Patriarca, eliminating the Guston and Solomon gangs would have been risky, but for the Boston Mafia of the 1930s, such decisive action was rare and a prerequisite for even greater prosperity. The Mafia had not yet achieved complete control of the city, but it was gradually rising above other criminal groups. In the mid-1950s, Philip Bucola left Boston with his wife and moved to Sicily. For a while, he maintained the title of boss during his absence and kept in touch with New England through intermediaries. By about 1956, however, he had finally lost power, and in that same year, Raymond Patriarca officially took over management of the New England family. Bucola had intermittent influence in Boston over the following decades. He was known, for example, to sponsor some members of the Sicilian Mafia who came to town in the mid-1980s. But in general, after stepping away from Boston, Philip Bucola spent the rest of his life, for the most part, doing legitimate business. He rented a large house in Palermo, built chicken coops, a hatchery building, a slaughterhouse, and began supplying restaurants and stores with poultry, and later opened his own small supermarket. Before his death, Bucola was interested in mafia affairs, but it was a simple curiosity, not collecting information for any personal purposes. And we move on to the most interesting period in the history of the Boston Mafia, the reign of Raymond Patriarca. His time was golden for the criminal organization when it reached the level of a vast business empire. Raymond Patriarca was born in 1908 to an Italian immigrant and an Italian woman from Worcester, Massachusetts. The place of his birth caused controversy among researchers, some believing it was Worcester, others that it was Providence. Many years later, Patriarca himself settled the matter when he testified before the US Senate. According to him, Eleuterio and Mary Jane Patriarca lived in Providence, but his mother traveled to Worcester for childbirth. Raymond Patriarca's family lived in the Federal Hill neighborhood west of Providence. Before Prohibition was declared, Raymond's father had a bar. What he did after Prohibition is not known exactly. His involvement in bootlegging is also likely. When Raymond was about 17, his father passed away. After graduating from high school, Patriarca took a job as a bellhop at a hotel in Providence, but did not last long and turned his attention to quicker ways of making money. He reportedly worked as a security guard on a ship that was involved in the illegal liquor trade. Because of his bootlegging activities, young Raymond Patriarca was arrested several times, receiving sentences of several days in jail and fines. In 1929, he was convicted of burglary, for which he received 2 years in prison, of which he served 1, receiving parole. Once released, Raymond returned to his underworld friends and illegal ways of making money. Between 1930 and 1938, Patriarca was arrested and fined several times for minor infractions. During this time, he became acquainted with Worcester gangster Frank Iacone. Patriarca is also rumored to have become a member of the Genovese family. In August 1938, Raymond Patriarca was convicted of breaking and entering and the following month of robbery in Brooklyn and theft of an automobile there. Although he was sentenced to several years in prison, he spent only a few months behind bars and was released just before Christmas. But in 1939, new charges were brought against Patriarca. While awaiting the court's decisions, Patriarca did not sit idly by. After a falling out with Frank Iacone, Patriarca decided to take control of Worcester's illegal gambling and interrupt the revenue stream of Iacone, who owned several gambling establishments. Patriarca organized about 4 robberies of Iacone's establishments. After another raid, which brought Raymond $19,000, he received a peace offer. Having settled their differences, Iacone and Patriarca established a strong and profitable alliance in the gambling business in Worcester. But in May 1940, Raymond received a sentence of 18 months imprisonment, which was subsequently extended until 1944 due to ongoing proceedings. Once out of prison, Patriarca began to gradually seize areas of influence in Rhode Island from Frank Morelli, who was dying of cancer, and spread his influence in Providence. It must have been at this time that he moved from the Genovese family to the New England Mafia, where he began a rapid rise through the ranks. In 1956, he became the boss. During Patriarca's reign, the New England family's area of interest expanded from New Haven to Maine. They had almost complete control over some illegal markets, especially gambling, usury, and pornography. Patriarca himself had some national investments, profiting from 2 casinos in Las Vegas and some deals in Florida and Philadelphia. In the same way, Patriarca was able to gain political clout at the local level. As FBI investigations revealed, he had close contacts with governors, legislators, and judges in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. In the late 1950s, Raymond Patriarca found a man who helped him increase his influence in Boston. He turned out to be Gennaro Angiulo. Legend has it that he arrived in the mob boss's house in Providence with an envelope full of tribute and a request for the privilege of running gambling in Boston, and this was exactly the kind of reservoir that was poorly utilized but had great potential. Patriarca later made Angiulo his underboss, and the duo took the Boston mob to a new level. Patriarca and Angiulo had the same origin. Their parents were poor immigrants from southern Italy, but further their fates went on different directions. Unlike Patriarca, Angiulo paved his way to success through cunning rather than force. Until the age of 28, he was a simple guy from a large and poor family who drove a truck on the streets of the North End and managed to serve in the Navy. Not to say that the family's situation was worse than other working-class neighbors, but it left an imprint on Gennaro's soul, and throughout his career, Angiulo was obsessed with money and power. After serving in the Navy, he turned to gambling. By day, Gennaro drove a truck, and at night he worked for the consigliere of the Joe Lombardo family, taking bets from which he set aside money for his ventures. He later switched to the gambling business in Roxbury and the North End. In 1950, organized crime in the United States was given a good shake by a U.S. Senate Select Committee known as the Kefauver Committee. The government's attention to organized crime in their area made Joe Lombardo tense up, shut down some mafia businesses, and loosen ties with other groups. But the threat soon passed, and the committee focused on more established crime-ridden cities like New York and Chicago. Boston's criminals were able to breathe freely, and during this time of upheaval, Angiulo quickly took steps to expand his own gambling enterprises. In the end, by the late 1950s, he had one last obstacle left in front of him. He was a non-mafia freelance criminal and therefore a target for the mafia. There is a theory that he solved this problem by sending an envelope containing $50,000 to Raymond Patriarca in Providence and promising him at least $100,000 a year for the right to run Boston and family membership. Whether this was the case or not is unknown, but in the 1950s, Angiulo did join the Patriarca family. By 1961, Angiulo had extensive real estate investments, interests in 2 car dealerships in Lynn and a country club, and owned a small hospital in Boston. He took a strong stand against the independent gangsters who made money from the gambling business, setting up a system in which mafia enforcers were assigned to these bookies. They collected part of their income as tribute and gave part of their earnings to Angiulo, who, continuing the chain, gave part to Patriarca. By this time, the mafia had already corrupted the government enough at various levels. Raymond Patriarca had connections with governors, legislators, and judges in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. He could even occasionally influence local legislation and, of course, get favorable court treatment for his people. In Boston, Angiulo maintained ties with the city police to protect his gambling networks. In addition to ties with the police, another important element of Angiulo's growing wealth was the exploitation of gangsters who did not belong to the mafia but took most of the risk and did the dirty work. The relationship between Patriarca and Angiulo is worth mentioning. The mutually beneficial cooperation they found did not develop into friendship, largely because Angiulo served as a source of not only income but also problems for his boss. Often, when Gennaro traveled to Providence every 2 weeks to pay his respects to Patriarca, the latter also had to listen to cases that needed to be settled. The temperamental and greedy Angiulo would sometimes trespass on someone else's property, pick a fight, and then rush to Providence and appear before his boss as the aggrieved party. For much of the 1960s, Patriarca and Anguillo were in a long conflict. In the early 1960s, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy forced the FBI to shift its focus from the communists to the Mafia. Thus, the FBI officers working to put mobsters away increased enormously in size. For example, the New York office increased the number of agents from 4 to 150 between 1959 and 1962. The Boston office kept pace, creating an organized crime unit under Dennis Condon, who teamed up with another FBI agent, Paul Rico. Around the same time, there was a spike in Irish gang violence in the underworld, which began in August 1960 after a gangster insulted the wife of a rival gang member. The alleys of Somerville and Charlestown became battlefields, with the death toll reaching double digits and growing daily. At first, Anguillo encouraged the chaos of the underworld as something he could use to his advantage, but the situation was getting out of control, and Raymond Patriarca began to express his displeasure about it. Anguillo thought his main problem was Patriarca's frustration over the gang war, but he had no idea that at this time a threat was looming on the horizon in front of him in the form of FBI agents Rico and Condon. The FBI was trying its best to gather information about the Boston Mafia, but by then they had only a vague idea of its structure. The information they had was not enough to be evidence in a court of law. The agents tried to raid Anguillo's gambling establishments, but this only slightly alarmed the mobsters and made them hide even more thoroughly. It seemed that the harder the FBI tried to penetrate Anguillo's world, the more elusive Gennaro himself became. When police detained him along with other alleged mafia leaders in 1965, they had nothing on Anguillo, and the mobster easily refused to answer any questions and soon left the scene of interrogation. Over time, however, the FBI discovered a weak link in the mafia's armor: a growing number of mercenaries commonly referred to as family partners. And beginning in 1966, Condon and Rico made a deal with Joseph Barbosa, the most ferocious of the mafia's standing army of hitmen, who was known by the nickname The Animal. Joe Barbosa was an American with Portuguese roots. His father was a boxer and a criminal who left his wife and 4 children when Joe was 12. Barbosa's crimes began as a child, and at 17 he was already leading a gang of young robbers. At 18, he was sentenced to time at Concord Correctional Institution, and 3 years later, he led the largest escape in the prison's history. His gang of 7 attacked several guards and stole the car of one of them, but the car was old and therefore broke down in the middle of the road. Barbosa and his comrades made it to a nearby gas station and stole a new car. While law enforcement was actively searching for the fugitives, the criminals themselves, instead of hiding, visited a bar and drunkenly wandered around Lynn and Revere until they were finally captured at a subway station in East Boston, where they surrendered peacefully to 3 armed police officers. Afterward, Barbosa awaited a maximum security prison from which he was released in 1958 on parole. Once free, he became one of the regular hitmen of the Mafia. This guy became the link between the Mafia, who used him for their own purposes, and the police, who kept watching him. The Mafia felt Barbosa was a threat and gradually alienated him. By October 1966, it became fully clear to Barbosa that he had lost the favor of the Mafia. Earlier that month, he and 3 local gangsters were arrested on weapons charges. The other gangsters were released on small bail, but Barbosa's bail was set at $100,000 and he couldn't post it himself. He waited for Anguillo or Patriarca to send their men with the money, but neither did. The bandits who had been detained with Barbosa came to the rescue and began attacking other criminals to extort money. But they made a mistake and chose Anguillo's subordinate as their new victim, which led to their deaths. All in all, things were not good at all for Barbosa. His buddies were killed and the money they had collected went missing. Just at this time, taking advantage of his position, FBI agents Condon and Rico began to visit him in prison. In their opinion, Barbosa would make an ideal informant, and they began to gradually persuade him to their side. Barbosa hesitated for a long time, but after a few months, the agreement was made, and he began to tell the agents about the murders committed by the mafioso in the last 2 years. In the summer of 1967, the first bombs began to land on the Mafia. On June 20, Patriarca and 2 other mobsters were charged with the murder of bookmaker Willie Maffeo. On August 9, 4 Mafia members, among them Gennaro Angulo, were charged with the murder of boxer Rocco Di Cello. In turn, the Mafia made one last attempt to get Joe Barbosa back on their side. They offered him $25,000 to stop talking, and he demanded $50,000. The mob was willing to do this as well, but after talking to his attorney and FBI agents, Barbosa decided to go ahead with what he had started. Gennaro Angulo was the first to come out to battle with Joe Barbosa. In January 1968, Barbosa's star witness testified against him in a Boston courtroom for 4 days. The jury listened as a huge and intimidating Barbosa described Angulo's orchestrated murder and had no confidence in him. The verdict they rendered found Angulo not guilty, but the Mafia won only the first round. Prosecutors still relied on Barbosa's testimony, but, given past mistakes, used other witnesses and emphasized physical evidence. 2 months after Angulo's acquittal, Raymond Patriarca was found guilty of conspiracy to murder Maffeo. He remained behind bars until 1975, but those 6 years, his power in the Mafia did not waver. Patriarca ran the family from prison, ensuring continuity of operations in the underworld and relaying messages to other mobsters when a particular problem required his input. But of course, the mob couldn't forgive such a thing, and threats poured in on Barbosa. Knowing this, the FBI often moved Barbosa from one hideout to another. But on February 2, 1976, retribution came. Barbosa left his apartment at noon and headed for his car. 4 shots rang out from a white van stopped nearby, and Barbosa was instantly killed. It was later determined that the killer was mobster Joe Rosso. In the 1970s, the FBI had exhausted its arsenal of informants, and its target, Gennaro Angulo, was still missing. Moreover, having gotten away with it in the 60s, Angulo felt empowered and further consolidated his position. Through money and connections, he increased his control over Boston's independent bookies and loan sharks, including Irish gangsters. The leader of the Winter Hill Irish gang, Howie Winter, was to pay Angulo $20,000 weekly. On top of that, Winter personally owed Angulo $250,000. Because of the above reasons, the FBI shifted its attention to stopping the gambling and loan sharking operations that were feeding the Mafia leaders. Numerous investigations into gambling began in Boston. Some bookmakers and loan sharks were arrested, but Gennaro Angulo remained out of reach. The situation was complicated by the fact that even the few mobsters who were willing to cooperate with the FBI knew little about the inner workings of Angulo's enterprise. Gennaro operated in the strictest secrecy. In 1979, FBI agents tried to record Gennaro and his associates going in and out of the Mafia office so they could later get a judge's permission to wiretap them. At least twice they were unmasked by Angulo. Extreme caution had to be exercised, and the information gathering process progressed at a snail's pace. It wasn't until 2 years later, in January 1981, that the Mafia office wiretapping operation was approved by the US District Judge Arthur Garrity. Thanks to their informants, FBI agents knew that Angulo conducted almost all his business at his headquarters in the North End. The problem was getting inside and installing listening devices. Besides, even the best FBI agents didn't know what was going on in the office from midnight till dawn, whether anyone was still inside or whether the office was empty. FBI agents had only 30 days to break into Angulo's office, and the first 3 attempts failed because mobsters were hanging around the building. On the 10th day, things started to move. 2 agents blocked the passage with their cars and pretended to be drivers whose cars had stalled in the bitter cold. In this way, they concealed 3 agents who were to run into the office building from a neighboring house. The agents made their way to the office door and picked the lock. The office was empty, with only the radio on to give the illusion of the owner's presence. The agents went to work, staying alert and hiding when the radio alerted them to people and cars passing near the house. Guided by their informants, the agents placed the bugs as close as possible to where Gennaro Angulo was sitting. By 5 a.m., the uninvited guests left the office and congratulated each other on a small victory. Small because there were still many months of work ahead. it was necessary to eavesdrop on conversations in the office of the mafioso and accumulate evidence against Angiulo and his associates. In the same year, bugs were also installed in the headquarters of the family captain Larry Zannino, but the details of this operation unfortunately are not known. At first, the agents faced the problem of noise. During conversations with other mafiosi, Angiulo often turned on the TV or radio, but after a few days the listeners became accustomed to distinguishing voices against the background of other sounds and did not even need special technical equipment. In addition, Gennaro tended to switch to shouting, which made it easier for the agents. Over the next 105 days, the FBI overheard numerous conversations concerning bookmakers, gambling, loan sharks, and murders. Agents heard the names of the mobsters responsible and learned the daily routine of the Angiulo family. About 25 agents worked in shifts every day in the tiny apartment where the listening equipment was installed. There were days when there were no useful conversations in the office for the FBI. There were days when you had to listen to silence for a long time. In general, it was sometimes a very tedious job, and the agents survived as best they could, choosing a quote of the day, eating donuts and watching movies. The bugs installed in Angiulo's office ran on batteries, and about once every 30 days, the FBI agents had to go back to the office and change them. Repeated times went almost without problems, and after the first break-in, they even had a manufactured key to the office. The case argued, and on September 19, 1983, in the restaurant Francesca, located in the North End, Angiulo and his brothers Frank and Mike were arrested by FBI agents led by Edward Quinn. A little later, Angiulo's other two brothers, Niccolo and Danny, were also captured. Leaving the restaurant, Gennaro promised to come back for his pork chops before they got cold, but those were empty words. Preparing for the trial took 2 years, and this time in the battle between the government and the mafia, Angiulo came out the loser. In 1986, accused of illegal gambling, racketeering, usury, and obstruction of justice, Angiulo was sentenced to 45 years in prison. Frank and Danny Angiulo and mobster Sammy Granito were convicted at the same time as Gennaro. Gennaro Angiulo, due to poor health, was paroled in 2007 and lived for 2 more years. After Gennaro's departure from power, Boston's underworld was fractured. Angiulo had not prepared a worthy successor with his knowledge and skills. The result was a struggle between young mobsters. The situation in the New England Mafia worsened with the death of Raymond Patriarca in July 1984. Once in prison, Angiulo tried to take the vacated seat but lost to Zannino and Raymond Patriarca's son. Gennaro was demoted to the rank of soldier, and decision-making for the Boston faction fell into the hands of the Rivera boys, who were longtime rivals of Angiulo. Having arrested Angiulo and several other mobsters, the agents congratulated each other on a major victory. But in the future, some of them, like John Connolly and John Morris, would have to pay a heavy price for their dizzying fame. After all, behind the scenes of the investigation of the Mafia, FBI led a dangerous game of favoritism with the main rival Gennaro, Irish gangster and informant Whitey Bulger. The fact is that Gennaro Angiulo, as already mentioned, from time to time interacted with the Irish group Winter Hill, the head of which after the arrest of Howie Winter became Bulger. Bulger's influence grew, and around 1975, the interests of the mobsters and the Irish gangsters collided. The FBI decided to capitalize on the impending war between the groups and hired Bulger as its informant. It is believed that he contributed to the success of the operation to place bugs in the office of the Mafia. Agents covered up Bulger's crimes in return for information, the importance of which was sometimes embellished, and generous gifts. In this way, they certainly changed the landscape of Boston's underworld, but how much it improved the city is a complicated question. Well, Whitey Bulger is a personality that requires a separate story, which you can listen to on our channel in our video about him, and we will return to the Boston Mafia, the power of which is gradually going down. Patriarca's son Raymond Jr., who was 39 years old at the time of his rise to power, was supported by a captain named Larry Zannino. The commission endorsed Raymond Jr. as boss, after which he made Zannino his deputy. But there was a problem. Zannino was also on trial in the 1980s. In 1985, he managed to dodge jail time when he collapsed from chest pains right in the courtroom, after which his case was suspended. but in 1987, Zannino was sentenced to 30 years in prison, and in February 1996, he died of natural causes at Springfield Medical Center for prisoners. Following Zannino's incarceration, Patriarca Jr. needed a new deputy, and William Grasso was appointed to that role. Raymond Jr. was not the most successful leader, especially when compared to his influential father, so a reputable mobster such as Grasso was necessary for him to retain power. In addition, the younger Patriarca largely stayed on as boss only because of the support of the Gambino Mafia family of New York. In 1989, Grasso was assassinated by Nicholas Bianco, a member of the Providence family faction. Gradually, Bianco began to take over the reins from the weak and unreliable Raymond Jr. He could have become the family boss, but on March 26, 1990, 21 family members, including Patriarca and Bianco, were indicted on charges that included conspiracy to murder, racketeering, and gambling. The media described the ensuing arrests as one of the largest, if not the largest, series of indictments against a single family in American history, at least at the time. Among the evidence presented in court was a recorded conversation between members of the mob in 1989. This recording played a major role in the fate of the Mafia, and it fell into the hands of the feds as follows. In October 1989, a member of the Boston Mafia, Angelo Mercurio, informed Stephen Flemmi, an informant, about the upcoming meeting of about 13 mobsters in Medford. In turn, he let FBI agent John Connolly know about everything. The mobsters' meeting place was bugged. It was not a simple mobster meeting. 4 men were to be initiated into the family that day. The listening devices recorded Patriarca Jr. reciting the oaths that the inductees were to repeat. The FBI managed to get hold of a 5-hour compromising tape of the event. It was a great humiliation for the Mafia. The secret ritual, which had been performed by mafiosi for more than 100 years and was brought by Italians from their homeland, became a subject of ridicule in the media and lost its value. Of course, the main culprit was Raymond Jr. After this incident, the commission decided to remove him as boss, and Patriarca's place was taken by Nicholas Bianco. However, a year later, in March 1990, Bianco was among the accused mobsters. Another defendant in the trial was John Castagna, a reputable gangster who unexpectedly decided to also play the role of a witness and testify. In them, he spoke, among other things, about how Patriarca Jr. was not only removed from his position as boss, but he was also actually threatened with taking his life. As a result of this testimony, Bianco received an 11.5-year prison sentence in November 1991. In January, 8 other mobsters also pleaded guilty and received serious sentences. Notably, Patriarca Jr. received 8 years in prison. The following year, more than 26 people were convicted of bookmaking. On November 16, 1994, Bianco died of Lou Gehrig's disease at Springfield Federal Medical Center. After this devastating trial, power in the New England Mafia passed into the hands of Frank Salemi. The new leadership moved the family's base back to Massachusetts after having been in Providence since the 1950s, when Patriarca Sr. made administrative changes. Salemi was born in 1933 and became involved in criminal activity while still young. In 1957, while behind bars, he met Anthony Morelli, a mobster in the Patriarca family, who introduced his new friend to the rest of the mob. Once released, Salemi soon began working for Patriarca. Salemi's career went upward after the bloody Irish gang war in the 1960s, when he first tried his hand as a hitman. In 1968, he was one of those who planned the assassination of John Fitzgerald, Joseph Barbosa's lawyer. In a provoked explosion, the lawyer lost his leg but survived, and Salemi had to go into hiding. In 1972, he was captured and received a 16-year prison sentence. He was eventually released from prison in 1989. Through his connections with Stephen Flemmi, Salemi became an ally of Winter Hill leader Whitey Bulger, which would auction him off later. When Angulo went to prison in 1986 and a power vacuum developed, Salemi attempted to take over as leader, leading to armed conflict. In June 1989, it came down to an attempt on Salemi's life. One morning, Mercurio called Frank and set up a meeting in the small town of Saugus, Massachusetts. As Salemi stood on the street, he was attacked by a group of armed men. He was wounded in the leg and chest but survived, and the Boston Mafia civil war continued until the head of the Gambino family, John Gotti, intervened and helped broker a peace agreement. As a result of these events, Bianco became the leader of the family in 1990, but when he went to prison a year later, Salemme, who was backed by Winter Hill, took his place. Salemme made mafia history by leading the Patriarca family into an era of turbulence, when shootouts between gangsters in the morning became normal. Many were still unhappy with his candidacy for boss. Robert Carossa led the opposition, and after his arrest, his closest associates Michael Romano Sr. and Anthony Ciampi continued the war. In 1991, 3 of Salemme's opponents were killed. In 1992, 3 more opponents were shot dead. No one was convicted of these murders, and the names of the perpetrators remained secret, although there is a strong possibility that Salemme's crony Mark Rossetti was either a participant in or aided and abetted the crimes. In 1994, the renegade faction retaliated against Salemme by eliminating 3 of his supporters. That same year, the parties attempted to resolve their differences through negotiations but failed to reach a truce. The feud flared up with renewed vigor after Michael Romano Jr., the son of one of Salemme's main opponents, was killed in September 1994. The enraged father and his supporters decided to take revenge, which was followed by another string of brutal murders. After Salemme's arrest, the war began to subside, largely because its participants either left the world or went to jail, although the fighting lasted until about 1998. In January 1995, Salemme was indicted along with Winter Hill gang members Whitey Bulger and Stephen Flemmi. Salemme was given an 11-year sentence. In 1999, while behind bars, Salemme learned that Bulger, the boss of one of Boston's major gangs, was an FBI informant who had been an informant for more than 2 decades, and that Stephen Flemmi was also an informant. It became obvious that Stephen and Bulger were one of the reasons why Salemme was in prison. He didn't let it go, and in 2001, he decided to go up against Bulger and Flemmi himself, providing the government with information about FBI agent John Connolly's corrupt work with them. But while he was busy with this tumultuous activity, the question of who would be leader came up again in the Patriarca family. The Salemme faction still held a high position in the Mafia. Against them in the battle for supremacy in the family were 4 captains along with their subordinates. The conflict began in April 1996 when 63-year-old Richard DeVincent, who had rebelled against the Salemme faction, was killed in Medford. Internal strife followed, but the rebellious faction was dismantled a year later when the FBI indicted 15 members, including all its leaders. The internecine war ended, and a new man named Luigi Manocchio was appointed boss. Manocchio was born in 1927, had been a gangster for most of his life. His arrest began in the 40s when he was a teenager. In 1969, he was charged with the murders of bookie Willie Marfaux and his brother Rudolph. Manocchio fled to France and was declared wanted. Upon returning to the United States, he hid in New York City for a time, but eventually, after about 10 years on the run, Manocchio surrendered to authorities and spent less than 3 years behind bars. In July 1996, Manocchio, along with other gangsters, was charged with stealing more than $10 million worth of merchandise. Manocchio pleaded guilty again and received a 3-year sentence. Generally, Manocchio was known as a quiet, old-school mobster who kept a low profile and out of the public eye. He moved his office back to Providence, to the old neighborhood where Raymond Patriarca's office once stood. In 2008, Manocchio was forced to step down as boss when more serious charges of extortion conspiracy were brought against him. Note that at this time, after infighting and constant arrests, the Patriarca family already seemed a shadow of what it had been under Raymond Sr. It was increasingly losing to the authorities and was much smaller. By 2012, the number of active members would reach 60 and only go downhill from there. After Manocchio's imprisonment, Peter Limone became the family's new boss, and the Mafia's headquarters again moved to Boston. But in the role of leader, Limone did not last long. In 2010, when he was charged with collusion with Manocchio, Anthony D'Annunzio took over. Though it's worth noting that D'Annunzio didn't oust Limone, he only became acting boss. but the sun didn't shine on him for long either. In 2010, numerous members of the Patriarca and Gambino families were charged with extortion conspiracy, and D'Annunzio was among the accused. In November of that year, he received a 6-year prison sentence, and the role of acting boss was taken over by Antonio Spagnolo. On October 2, 2014, Spagnolo and family captain Price Quintina, both in their 70s at the time, were arrested for extorting club owners who were illegally installing gambling machines in their establishments. As of 2015, it was not clear who was running the family: Limone, Anthony D'Annunzio's brother Carmen D'Annunzio, or Spagnolo. In 2017, Limone passed away from cancer, which likely solidified D'Annunzio's position as boss. Globalization and advances in technology have changed this world dramatically, and the schemes by which mafia members used to operate no longer worked. Mafiosi had to adapt to the new realities. Many went into legitimate business. They opened their own cafes or car dealerships. Others engaged in digital fraud, gambling, pornography, and extortion on the internet. Who is in the Boston Mafia and who is currently leading it is a mystery that we probably won't be able to solve for years to come. But it can be argued that the golden age of the Boston Mafia is already in the distant past, and we can see the legendary old-school mobsters only on the screens of monitors or pages of books.